You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Abbeville Institute podcast. I am Brian McClanahan, your host, and we're going to talk about the week that was at the Abbeville Institute between November 23rd and November 27th, 2015. So I hope you enjoy our discussion today about what we put on the website and why we thought this was important. So first and foremost, some housekeeping. We have a conference coming up February 26th and 27th in Charleston, South Carolina. We hope you attend. It's going to be a fantastic conference. The topic is the PC attack on the South, and it's going to feature a number of great speakers, including yours truly, along with Don Livingston, Clyde Wilson, Tom Fleming of Chronicles Magazine, also Bertram Hayes Davis, who is the great-grandson of Jefferson Davis, among others. Dr. Kerry Roberts will be there, Barbara Murthel. So we would love for you to come out and enjoy our discussion. You can find more information on that on our website, www.abbevilleinstitute.org. So let's talk about the week that was at the Abbeville Institute. And before I do that, before I discuss the 5 articles for this week, I'd like to take some time and talk about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was just this week on Thursday, and what you're going to hear today is not discussed in any American classroom in the country. I can almost guarantee that. It's not a story that people often know because of the New Englandification of our history courses in America today. As Susan Mary Grant has pointed out, we have a north over south situation in American history. Anyone who has any historical knowledge recognizes this. Even Arthur Schlesinger, who is the very famous progressive historian, recognized back in the 1960s that there was a New England bias to history. And so when you talk about Thanksgiving, we all know the story of the Pilgrims and their Thanksgiving in 1621 and how they were helped out by 2 English-speaking American Indians in that very tough winter when many people died and they had a hard time getting through to survive into the spring and then into a great harvest that led to their Thanksgiving in 1621. But what most people don't realize is that the first Thanksgiving was not held in New England. It was held in Virginia. In fact, it was held on December 4th, 1619. Now, Virginia was the first permanent English settlement in North America, and Jamestown was the first permanent city, so to speak, or town in North America, as far as English-speaking settlement in North America. And it was established in 1607. But 12 years later, you had 38 members of a voyage, an expedition to Virginia. It was led by a man named Captain John Woodleaf, and they sailed on a ship called the Margaret. So everyone knows of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, but the Margaret landed in Barclay Hundred in Virginia in December 4th, actually, 1619. And when they opened their orders, they read that there was a charge from the London Company to ordain that the day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for plantation and the land of Virginia shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God. And they did that. For a number of years, the Virginians celebrated December 4th as a day of thanksgiving. But it's also important to note that these were also the people to establish the first legislative assembly in the English-speaking colonies in North America, not Plymouth. So Virginia was first in a number of things, and we actually ran an article a couple of weeks ago from Lyon Tyler, who was President John Tyler's son, who was also Gardner Tyler was the president of the College of William and Mary. Very good Southern historian and he wrote a little pamphlet entitled Virginia First, where he gets into this, among other things, how Virginia was the first permanent colony and all the things that Virginia did first. Most people don't recognize that or realize that. They think that Massachusetts or Plymouth was first in a number of areas. It's just not true. Virginia was first in just about everything. And so when you think about Thanksgiving in the future, think about Virginia. Think about the South. Because the South was first. It was first in establishing a foothold here in British North America. The first heroes in British North America were Southerners. In fact, New England wouldn't even have the name if it wasn't for John Smith, who was, of course, in Virginia. But we don't think about that. We think of Plymouth and New England as being first. It's just not true. Now, one of the themes for this week, as we get into the articles, was this, or is this idea of a lost cause in the Southern tradition. One of the common attacks against the Institute or people who promote Southern history or promote a Southern version of the war is that, well, this is just all bunk. It's all nonsense. It's simply a reinterpretation or a fabrication of the true causation of the war. And that everything that Southerners said after the war was a lie, and everything Northerners said after the war was true. Everything Southerners said about the war itself was just a way to make themselves look better in the eyes of the world, and that Northerners were telling the truth the entire time. And so the first article we ran on the 23rd, on Monday the 23rd, was by John Marquardt. And Mr. Marquardt is actually from Japan. He's a World War II vet. I had the pleasure of meeting him at Stone Mountain when we had our conference there in October. Flew all the way from Tokyo and showed up at the conference. He said he wasn't going to come, and then he showed up, and it was great to meet him. He's written for us a number of times, always very interesting articles on some out-of-the-way topics. And this is one of those, but it fit nicely with the other material that we had for this week, because he talks about, he really punches holes, I should say, in this idea of the infallible North, that they would never tell a lie. These Northerners would never tell a lie. And so this particular article is entitled Kentucky's Baron Munchausen. And the interesting thing about it, it's about a book by a man named William G. Stevenson entitled 13 Months in the Rebel Army. And essentially what this guy Stevenson did is he fabricated an entire story about the war, including some disparaging comments about Robert E. Lee, among other things. But people picked up on this book, and they cited it over and over again. Even into the 1990s, people are citing this 13 Months in the Rebel Army as some type of definitive study on the South. And what Jack does in this particular article, it's not long, but he punches holes in everything that this guy said. This was a fantastic story, but there was no way this could be true. In fact, in one paragraph, Jack says, "So here we have a Northerner who had narrowly escaped 2 instances in which he could have been hanged as a hated Yankee abolitionist, being forced to enlist as a private in Memphis's newly formed Irish 2nd Tennessee Infantry Regiment. It doesn't make any sense." The South never would have done that. And then, of course, he talks about how Stevenson has these fantastic stories of battles where he narrowly escapes death and he's wounded. And then at one point, he's assigned to John H. Morgan's troopers. And then we find that he's on the staff of General John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States. And then he somehow gets to be an officer in the medical corps for the Confederacy. All this stuff just doesn't make any sense. Jack points out that no biographies or photographs of Stevenson seem to have ever been published, and there are apparently no records available pertaining to his birth, later life, or the date and place of his death. Likewise, there are now very few contemporary press accounts on file of either Stevenson or his popular book, and those that still exist, such as a front-page piece in the October 7, 1862 issue of the Louisville Daily Journal, merely present excerpts from the book with no critical comments or biographical information. And so he points out that people are starting to recognize that this book, even now, it's all a lie. It's a myth. If you want to talk about a myth, this is a myth. So often you hear the myth of the lost cause. This particular story, 13 months in the Confederate Army, just doesn't make any sense. And so we presented that particular article as a way to, punch holes in this this treasury, a counterfeit treasury of virtue, as it's often been called. The Yankees, Northerners, lie. And so when you start hearing this idea, well, all Southerners just lied about all these things. And we're going to talk about a piece here in just 1 second that's along that vein where people would come in and say, well, these people are just lying now. Here you have a Northerner who lied and fabricated an entire book about his experiences in the South. So on Tuesday, we published a piece by Bradley T. Johnson entitled No Lost Cause. Bradley T. Johnson was a Confederate general from Maryland during the war, and he had a really interesting career. In fact, if you want to learn about Maryland and the war, I would highly recommend a book by Bart Talbert entitled Maryland, the South's First Casualty. It's not in print anymore, but you can get it in used bookstores. It's an excellent book, and Dr. Talbert has told me for years that he was going to be writing a book on Bradley T. Johnson. He hasn't done it yet, but he wanted to do a biography of Bradley T. Johnson. So Johnson was head of the very famous Maryland Line in the War for Southern Independence. And so after the war was over, he was very much involved in presenting the true side of the Southern cause. And so in 1896, in fact it was February 1896, the Museum of the Confederacy opened in Richmond, and Johnson was invited to deliver the keynote address. And this particular speech is wonderful because it outlines all the different ideas, positions of the South before the war, during the war, and after the war. So here we are about 35 years after the war is over, or after the war began, I should say, 30 years after the war is over. And Johnson is making some really interesting statements about the war, the causation, and why we need to recognize the heroic deeds and valor of Southerners who served. And so I'm going to read you a few of the quotes from this particular speech. I find them fascinating and also invigorating. In fact, at one point, the last paragraph that I'll read, I find myself enthralled by his words. Such a great speech. So Johnson says in one of the sections, the title of this section is A Success in a Sense. And he says, it is our highest obligation to satisfy the world of the righteousness of our cause and the sound judgment with which we defended it. And we injure ourselves, we impair the moral of our side by incessant protestations of loyalty to the victor and continual assertions of respect for his motives, of forgiveness for his conduct, and of belief in the nobility of his faith. There never can be two rights nor two wrongs. One side must be right, and therefore the other is, of course, wrong. This is so of every question of morals and of conduct, and it must be preeminently so of a question which divided millions of people and which cost 1 million of lives. So there is no half right and half wrong. One side has to be right, one side has to be wrong. And then he said this, the world is surely coming to the conclusion that the cause of the Confederacy was right. Every lover of liberty, constitutional liberty, controlled by law, all over the world begins to understand that the past was not a war waged by the South in defense of slavery, but was a war to protect liberty, won and bequeathed by free ancestors. This is exactly what the historian James McPherson has said. The South was fighting for liberty, to protect themselves from being enslaved by the North. And so that's all Bradley T. Johnson is saying here. And he points out something that's very true all over the world, except here in the United States. And that's that all over the world, people recognize the Southern cause as something that was opposing centralization, tyranny. And so this is why you see the Confederate battle flag flown in places like China, in Tiananmen Square in 1989, or in Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. You see it for people opposing communist aggression. This is why they were flying that particular flag. They recognized this flag as a symbol of liberty, not oppression, of liberty. And then he goes on to talk about the principles of the revolution. And he points out that all governments rest on the consent of the governed, and that all that these states were doing in 1861 is following the plan of the path of the founding generation. The founding generation in 1775 and 1776 said, look, government rests on the consent of the governed, and we have a right to alter or to abolish the government and institute a new government. This is the Southern position. This is what Jefferson said. And then he says, society is immortal. Its atoms arrange and crystallize themselves from generation to generation according to their necessities, but society grows and expands, and constant changes are required in its organization. So when I talk in a couple more pieces about Richard Weaver, he gets into this idea of progress. And what we have to do in the South is frame our position, frame the Southern tradition as a progressive idea. And it really is. And this is all Johnson is saying. Look, the South was actually progressive in what it was doing. Certainly, it was hanging on to a tradition. Certainly, the tradition that had been laid out since 1215 was important to Southerners in the Magna Charta. But this was a progressive notion. They were trying to protect the tradition by instituting new government. And so this is what Southerners have to say as they start to defend our positions. We're not regressive, we're progressive in what we want to do in defending the old. And then he gets into the question of slavery. This is one of the main points of our conference in February, the PC attack on the South. We're going to discuss slavery. We're going to discuss it in the South. We're going to talk about it as a causation of the war. We're going to talk about it in the North. And this is what Johnson said about it. He said moral questions are subordinate, or the moral question of slavery was subordinate. He says this, quote, slavery was the source of political power and the inspiration of political institutions, and it was selected as the point of attack. The moral question was subordinate to the political and social one. The point of the right or wrong of slavery agitated but a few weak-minded and feeble men. The real, great, dominating, and controlling idea was the political and social one, the influence of the institution on character and institutions. There was forming in the South a military democracy, aggressive, ambitious, intellectual, and brave, such as led Athens in her brightest epoch and controlled Rome in her most glorious days. If that was not destroyed, the industrial society of the North would be dominated by it. So the entire social force, the press, the pulpit, the public schools, was put in operation to make distinctive war on Southern institutions and Southern character. And for 30 years attack, vituperation, and abuse were incessant. It was clear to the states of the South that there could be no peace with them, and there grew up a general desire to get away from them and to live separate. And then he says, she, the South, resisted invasion. It cannot be too often repeated or too plainly stated. Virginia, he said, never seceded from the Union, she resisted invasion of rights as her free ancestors for 800 years had done with arms and force. Before the Ordinance of Secession was voted on, Virginia was at war with the northern states, and all legal connection had been broken with them by their own act in the unlawful invasion of her soil. It is this constant and growing consciousness of the nobleness and justice and chivalry of the Confederate cause which constitutes the success and illuminates the triumph which we commemorate today. Evil dies, good lives, and the time will come when all the world will realize that the failure of the Confederacy was a great misfortune to humanity and will be the source of unnumbered woes to liberty. This great and noble cause, the principles of which I have attempted to formulate for you, was defended with a genius and a chivalry of men and women never equaled by any race. My heart melts now at the memory of those days. And then he describes the suffering of women in the Confederacy. This is often not addressed, but how the home front, how the people on the home front suffered during the war and the deprivations they sustained. There's a wonderful book about this, a first-hand account, entitled White and Black Under the Old Regime, and it's by Victoria Clayton. And she was the wife of Henry de Lamar Clayton. And she talks about what they had to go through in the South during the war, the things they didn't have. The same things that everyone went through during the American War for Independence that are often more discussed. But in the South, how hard it was, the things that they were without during the war, and they suffered under it gladly for independence. That's what they wanted more than anything else, was that idea of independence. And so Johnson concludes with a wonderful paragraph, and I'm going to read the entire thing to you. The section is entitled No Lost Cause, and that's where we took the title from. But this is what he says. Our memorial will be here in Richmond, the heart and grave of the Confederacy, and around it hovers the immortal soul of love and of memory, which for all times will sanctify it to all true men and women. They will know that it is a memorial of no lost cause. They will never believe that we thought we were right. They will know, as we know, that we were right, immortally right, and that the conqueror was wrong, eternally wrong. The great army of the dead is here. The sentiment of the living is here. The memories of the past are here. The monuments of the future will be here. As all roads lead to Rome, so in the ages to come all ties of memory, of sentiment, of heart, and of feeling will vibrate from Richmond. As every follower of the prophet at sunset turns his face to Mecca and sends up a prayer for the dead and the living, so everywhere in this great South land, which was the Confederacy, whenever the trumpet call of duty sounds, when the call to do right without regard to consequence rings over the woods and the meadows, the mountains and the valleys, the spirit of the Confederacy will rise. The dead of Hollywood and of Oakwood will stand in ranks, and their eternal memory will inspire their descendants to do right, whatever it cost of life or fortune, of danger and disaster. Lee will ride his bronze horse. Hill will be by his side. Stonewall will be there. Stuart's plume will float again, and the battle line of the Confederacy will move forward to do duty, justice, and right. The memorial of the Confederacy is here, not built by hands, made by memory and devotion. What else could it be? On Wednesday, in our weekly installment of Clyde Wilson's writings, we published the latest installment of his Sayings by Our Four Southerners. This is part 22. The previous 21 parts are all there. And these are fun little things. He gives us a number of quotes that apply to the South or were said by Southerners. And one of the best parts of this particular installment are two quotes by Will Rogers. Now, I have to admit, I didn't know who Will Rogers was. Well, I knew who he was. I'd heard of him. When I went to graduate school, I had never read anything by him or heard him speak. And then I took a reading seminar with Dr. Wilson, and I was introduced to Will Rogers, and he's so good, very, very funny. Young people miss out when they don't hear Will Rogers. And so there are two little quotes here by Will Rogers. They're both very funny, and I can just picture in my mind Will Rogers saying these. He had such a way of telling a story. But he said this: every time Congress makes a law, it's a joke. And every time Congress makes a joke, it's a law. And there is one thing no nation can accuse us of: secret diplomacy. Our foreign dealings are an open book, a checkbook. Quite true. And then he has a wonderful quote by the great conservative thinker Hilaire Belloc, who I wrote a chapter on, essentially, in my book with Clyde, Forgotten Conservatives in American History. It's the last chapter, and it was on the book Who Owns America, but I focused on Belloc quite a bit. And Belloc said this in 1938: nothing more fatal for an individual or a large society in the long run can be conceived than this blind dependence upon an assured good fortune, and an equally blind neglect of rational processes. It opens the door to every extravagance, material and spiritual, to conceptions of universal dominion, world power, and the rest of it, which in their effect are mortal poisons. So if you like those two quotes, you can go back and read that particular section. All these things, of course, are available on our website, abbevilleinstitute.org. So I'd highly recommend you go out and read them. And that was installment 22 of the Sayings by or for Southerners. On Thursday, on Thanksgiving Day, we published a piece by Richard Weaver, the great conservative philosopher who died in 1963. This was from his dissertation, The Southern Tradition at Bay. And he wrote this when he was 33 years old. And that's amazing to me. I published my first book when I was in my early 30s, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Founding Fathers. And I look at this particular book that he wrote when he was 33, and I look at mine, and I think, wow, this is so much better. And so it's amazing how good this particular book was. And it's a treatise on post-bellum thought in the South. So what Southerners were saying about themselves after the war. This is the lost cause period that everyone focuses on, and everyone says it's a distortion of the true position the South was taking before the war or during the war. They just fabricated everything after the war. And Weaver looks at this, and it's a wonderful examination of what Southerners were saying about themselves and how they were talking about their own section. And so Weaver, this book, by the way, was published after his death. So, but Weaver gets into this idea of the Southern tradition, and this is a beautiful, it's the epilogue of the book. This is a beautiful analysis of why we have the Abbeville Institute, why we do what we do. And so there's a wonderful quote at the end of the piece that I'm going to read. But before I get to that, first and foremost, he has a very nice definition of history. He says, history is a liberal art, and one profits by studying the whole of it, including the lost causes. So we should profit. We could profit by studying the South. And he says this, and this is why we can profit by studying the South. The South possesses an inheritance which it has imperfectly understood and little used. It is in the curious position of having been right without realizing the grounds of its rightness. I am conscious that this reverses the common judgment, but it may yet appear that the North, by its ready embrace of science and rationalism, impoverished itself, and that the South, by clinging more or less unashamedly to the primitive way of life, prepared itself for the longer run. And this is again why we have the Institute. So often, Southerners focus on a 4-year period of the war, and they say this is Southern tradition. The Southern tradition is 400 years. The Southern tradition is not just the cause for independence between 1861 and 1865. That was a byproduct of the Southern tradition. So what is the Southern tradition? And Weaver gets into this, and he also says, no Southern spokesman was ever able to show why the South was right finally. In other words, the South never perfected its worldview, which determines in the end what we want and what we are. Legal arguments, like those of the Apologia, are but a superstructure resting upon more fundamental assumptions. Journalistic defenses, however brilliant in phrase, are likely to be even less, and fiction may serve only as a means of propagation. So what Weaver is saying is that the South has not effectively defended itself over time. Another great failure, he says, and one for which people cannot be readily forgiven, is the surrender of initiative. So little has this section shown since 1865 that one is prompted to question whether the South ever really believed in itself. It is not that the South is uncreative. On the contrary, it is pregnant and full of dreams. It is always sending abroad some novelty to be adapted and perfected. The list would be long and astonishing, but it seems to have no faith in its own imprimatur. It has been unwilling to buy books and magazines unless they came with the prestige of a northern publisher. Indeed, this preference has extended over a vast range of things. Does it bespeak some deep-lying sense of incompetence, of inadequacy? The supposition classes with the widely noticed presumption and conceit of the Southerner, with his faith in the rightness of his way of life, which have irritated numberless people from the outside. So he's saying the South has got wonderful things to talk about, but people have lost the initiative to defend it, or to know how to defend it. And this is why we have the Abbeville Institute, to learn how to defend it. He says, Weaver says, in summary, I would say that the South needs now, as much as ever before, a metaphysic of its position, and that it must recover initiative, at least to the point of following a right course without waiting for the North or for Washington to express approbation. Only this can diminish its hypersensitivity to criticism, which makes the task even of its friends difficult. So don't wait around for the North to approve of what we're saying. Just say it, and people will come. People will recognize initiative. They recognize a defense, a manly defense. They recognize that, and they gravitate towards it. When you don't have that, when you sheepishly say, well, I know that we had some bad things, so we're trying to get the approval of the North. When you try to do that, you're never going to win. You're never going to defend what you are. He says, one might hesitate to say that the South, with such weaknesses, has anything to offer our age. But there is something in its heritage, half lost, derided, betrayed by its own sons, which continues to fascinate the world. This is a momentous fact, for the world is seeking, as perhaps never before, for the thing that will lift up our hearts and restore our faith in human communities. In a parallel way, victims of the confusions and frustrations of our own time turn with live interest to that fulfillment represented by the Old South. And it is this that they find, the last non-materialist civilization in the Western world. This is why the South can be attractive. And here we are, Thanksgiving and Black Friday, a very materialist position. And you think about all the people that go out on Thanksgiving Day, whether it is a northern holiday or not, We know the South had it first, but they go out on the day of Thanksgiving, a day of thanks, to be with family, to thank God for all that you have, and they go shopping. And they go shopping the day after. And they go shopping the weekend after. And people like to get deals, and there's nothing wrong with trying to save $1. But we forget what the South really offered in contrast to that. And that is where the South can be relevant. It is this refuge of sentiments and values, of spiritual congeniality, of belief in the Word, of reverence for symbolism, whose existence haunts the nation. It is damned for its virtues and praised for its faults, and there are those who wish its annihilation. But most revealing of all is the fear that it gestates the revolutionary impulse of our future. Now, who is going to lead this future? Well, Weaver says, but we must put aside the temptation of literalism and consider from what source we are likely to get the needful revelation. Barring the advent of an illumination by some fateful personality, the task falls upon poets, artists, intellectuals, upon workers in the timeless. We must again hearken to those unacknowledged legislators of mankind. They alone can impress us with some splendid image of a man in a morally designed world, ennobled by a conception of the transcendent. They will have to abandon, and I'm sure they will be ready to abandon, the tortured imaginings of our vexed decades. So it falls on the artists, the storytellers, the historians, the philosophers. It falls on us to bring this image to the present, to bring this heroic image of a past South. And he's going to explain why this is important. And it's not just sentimentalism to think about the past, but it's important to think about the future. And he says this: one word of advice must be given to the workers for this new order. Considerations of strategy and tactics forbid the use of symbols of lost causes. There cannot be a return to the Middle Ages or the Old South under slogans identified with them. The principles must be studied and used, but in such presentation that mankind will feel the march is forward. And so when we talk about things in the Abbeville Institute, it's in the Jeffersonian tradition, but how can we use that tradition to better man? To bring back a different type of life, of spiritualism, of living in the now, of putting our hands in the dirt. This is where, and I remember reading I'll Take My Stand in graduate school, and there was a leftist hippie guy in that class, and he loved that book. Why? Because it spoke of something that he liked. It was the agrarian South, and this is timeless, as Weaver says. It's why people are going to organic farming. It's why people are looking to get away from genetically modified food. It's why people are looking to have a garden in their backyard. It's why some people are looking to do things like homeschool, or why they're trying to remove from society, from this commercial society. It's why some people are saying no to Black Friday shopping or going out and trampling people at Walmart. It's why people are doing these things, because they're saying there's something good about not doing that. It's why people love the Chick-fil-A restaurant that closes on Sunday. It's quaint now. It used to be everything was closed on Sunday. It used to be that nothing was open on Thanksgiving or Christmas Day. But now everything is. It's just another shopping day. And so this is why this Jeffersonian tradition needs to be there. It offers a counterweight to all of this. It's progressive. And that's what Weaver is saying. The symbols are fine. But what do they represent is more the important thing. Why are Southern symbols important? What do they represent? How are they progressive? Not how are they regressive? They represent something that's good. And so it will be, he says, to all effects, It is a serious thing to take from the average man, and perhaps from anyone, his belief in progress. The average man's metaphysic is summed up by this word. Progressive is his token of approval. Therefore, the future will always be the future, and we need not lecture tediously on the imperishability of principles. It is enough if we let them inform the new order, while adorning them with the attractions of the hour. The river of knowledge often turns back on itself, and there are progressive revolutions to an earlier condition. As long as we keep our course clear by acknowledging the primacy of knowledge and virtue and avoid a surrender to suppositions, objective necessity, we can still reconstruct our life on a humane basis. There are progressive revolutions to an earlier condition. And that's all the Abbeville Institute is saying. What could we get out of an earlier condition that would be forward-looking? America is too big. How can we make it back to human scale? How can we bring it to that? This is the 10th Amendment movement. No one believes that the state governments are utopian systems of administration, that they're free of corruption. Everyone knows they are corrupt, but perhaps they're better than the monstrosity, than the Leviathan in Washington, D.C., with all its corruption, where you have no control over it. At least maybe at the state level you could control it a little bit. And then, of course, you can even go down to that. One of the things I find fascinating by the Doomsday Book from Old England, it was a census, more or less, to gather taxes. But one of the things that's really interesting about it is when you look at the size, the scale of the communities in the Middle Ages, a large town was 1,000 people. 1,000 people. That's amazing. That's the size of most people's subdivision. And so that was a large town. It was self-contained. And so when we think that, well, towns can't be, independent entities can't be 1,000 people, why not? Why not? These are questions that have to be asked. Why is it that the megastate is the only thing we think is viable in the modern world? Is that conducive to peace and prosperity? Is that the only thing we have? Is there no counterweight to that? People love the small. They feel at home in it. And I remember back in the 80s, there was that very famous television show, Cheers, which took place in Boston. But regardless, the theme song, everyone wants to go, you want to go where everyone knows your name. And they're always glad you came. And you can't have that in a faceless environment. You can only have it where you know people. This is why people like small towns. And that's really our life anyways, is the people we know. And so that's what the Abbeville Institute is about. That's the Southern tradition, where your state is your country, or in the case of Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina, his plantation was his country. He checked his mail once a month. His plantation was his country. That's what he knew. And so this is all Weaver is saying. The progressive can be tradition, and we just have to sell it. It's very important to do that. And then he concludes with this fantastic statement that summarizes perfectly the Abbeville Institute. And he says this: the Old South may indeed be a hall hung with splendid tapestries in which no one would care to live, but from them we can learn something of how to live. And in this idea, this position of artists leading the way, the final piece of the week was entitled Stapleton, and I wrote this, and it was just a very short little blog post, but it's about an artist, a musician, Chris Stapleton, who racked up at the Country Music Awards. And the reason I wanted to write about Chris Stapleton, he's now a household name. As I wrote this piece, his album Traveler was number 3 at Amazon.com. Stapleton had been around for a while. He'd written a number of songs, great songwriter. He had performed in other types of bands. But what really attracted me to Chris Stapleton was the time I met him. And I met him before he was a household name. I met him 2 years ago. and he was performing at a music festival in Columbus, Georgia. And I was actually there to see two other artists, another country artist and a rock band. And he did an early set, and no one knew who he was. I came there to see Shooter Jennings, in fact, Waylon Jennings' son. And Waylon Jennings pulls up in a tour bus, and he doesn't mingle with the people. He runs from his tour bus to the stage, and when he's done, he runs from his stage back to the tour bus and doesn't really talk to anyone. Chris Stapleton was different. And even now, I think he's a little different in how he interacts with fans and people. And I'll give you two instances of that. After the show, after he did his set, which was fantastic, he stayed for nearly 2 hours and shook hands and talked with folks. And I walked up to him and I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Nashville." And then I said, "No, where are you from?" And he smiled and said, "Kentucky." No one's from Nashville. No one who has anything to say is from Nashville. He was also there with his wife. His wife is his backup singer. And I remember the image. I still see this in my mind of them walking away. It was dark. They played their set during daylight. And then by the time it was dark, they left. They left in their own vehicle. They walked to their vehicle, and they drove away. And I remember when they walked to their vehicle, they carried, he had T-shirts and CDs and things to sell. And he carried the stuff himself, and he and his wife were walking arm in arm. And it was just such a beautiful scene. And his wife is always with him. And here's this guy that's now one of the best-known country singers in the country. In my opinion, the best voice, male vocalist in music right now. Not just country music, but in music entirely. Blues, rock, take your pick. He does it best. And there he was, just a humble family man. He actually sings about this in his songs. He's a humble family man. And he's worthy of everything being thrown his way right now. And if you listen to the songs, I mean, this is a story of his life. From being in his 20s to being a family man and what music has done for him, both good and bad. And I don't disagree with that. I mean, this is, when you listen to the album, you can see it. It's so good from beginning to end. Another instance where he used to communicate with his fans on social media over a year ago, I tweeted him about his other outfit, his rock band called the Johnson Brothers, and I was asking him a question about it, and he tweeted me right back and said, "No, there's going to be another Johnson Brothers album." Now, of course, this is before he became so big, and he's got thousands and thousands of followers. But there he was, just interacting with fans, saying, "Yeah, thanks. We're going to have another album." So he's a real down-to-earth person, and I said in the piece, I can honestly say I knew Chris Stapleton when. Now, I didn't know him personally. He wouldn't know me if I walked up to him. But there was a connection there. Someone who was just trying to make it, hanging out with his wife, interacting with fans. And I want good things for him. You want good things for good people. And he seems like a good person. And Chris Stapleton is bringing the South, bringing the art. One of the songs in particular, it's a cover of George Jones's Tennessee Whiskey, and it sounds like it came right out of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. It's just perfect. And I remember when I first heard it, it was exciting for that. It wasn't recorded in Muscle Shoals, but here's Muscle Shoals, and it had that sound to it. The blues, the country, the rock that comes out of it is so good. And so if you haven't bought the album yet, if you don't know about it, go out and buy it. So that was the concluding piece of our week at the Abbeville Institute from the 23rd to the 27th of November. Please help us keep the lights on at the Abbeville Institute. If you like what we're doing, if you like the articles we publish, if you like our podcast, if you want to come to a conference, if you like our conferences, please donate to us. It is a tax-deductible donation to the full extent of the law. We have various levels for membership. Please contribute to our cause to help explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. We can't do this without you. We exist on your generous support. So please consider that when you're thinking about the end of the year is coming up, getting ready for your taxes at the end of the year, trying to look at how you're going to pay your taxes next year. You can get a little cut off of that by contributing to the Abbeville Institute. So hope you enjoyed the podcast. This, of course, was episode 2, and we will see you next week. I am Brian McClanahan. Good day.